Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Danielle McLaughlin, and welcome to October's Fiction at the Friary. This month, as well as our online event, we're also having an in-person event at the Friary Bar on North Mall from 3 to 6 p.m. This month's guest author is our very own Madeleine D'Arcy, whose superb short story collection, Liberty Terrace, is published this week by Dura Press. And we have the wonderful Anne O'Leary joining us today to talk to Madeleine about her new book. Anne has won many awards for her own fiction, including the Molly Keane Award 2018 and the From the Well Short Story Competition 2017. Her stories have been selected on a number of occasions for the Best British and Irish Flash Fiction and nominated for Best Microfiction 2020. And they have been widely published in journals and anthologies, including Jellyfish Review, The Stone, Ellipsis, and many, many others. She was also a runner-up in Novel Fair 2021, and we're delighted that she has agreed to join us today to chat to Madeleine about Liberty Terrace. Before we begin, I would just like to very briefly thank our sponsors, who for this year are the Arts Council, Cork City Council, Cork City Libraries, the Department of English, UCC, Hogan Architects, J. Ralph O'Mara Solicitors, and Mike D'Arcy of the Friary Bar, who has been such a great support to us since Fiction at the Friary began. And now I'm going to hand over to Anne.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Danielle, and it's an absolute pleasure to be invited to participate in this and to celebrate Madeleine's fabulous book, Liberty Terrace. It feels a little bit like standing in for Ant or Dec, but I'm going to I'll give it my best shot. So just to do a little introduction to Madeleine. Madeleine D'Arcy is a fiction writer based in Cork City. Her second book, Liberty Terrace, is published by Dura Press. It's a linked short story collection and was launched earlier this week at Cork City Library. A preview in the Sunday Independent on the 10th of October described the book as a charming and honest commentary on modern Ireland, enchanting and engaging. Her debut short story collection, Waiting for the Bullet, also published by Dura Press in 2014, won the Edge Hill Reader's Choice Prize Award in 2015. In 2010, she received the Hennessy Literary Award for First Fiction and the Hennessy New Irish Writer Award. Her short fiction has also been widely published in various anthologies and journals and has been listed in a variety of competitions. And she's recently completed a novel. Since January 2017, she has co-curated Fiction at the Friary, a free monthly fiction event in Cork City with fellow writer Danielle McLaughlin. So Madeleine, you're very welcome to your own Flash Fiction at the Friary event, and about time too, I think. I believe you're going to read a little piece for us to begin with.
Thank you so much, Anne, for stepping in to co-host this month's Fiction at the Friary, and thank you so much, Danielle, for organising it. The shoe's on the other foot now. I'll read actually a little bit from a story that is close to the beginning of the collection, because the stories run from 2016 to 2020. And the reason for that really is I began writing or thinking about this collection earlier, and then the pandemic struck. So kind of organically, the later stories bring in the pandemic and they're written later as well. But this one isn't. It's even got a plane journey on it, and the narrator, I suppose, it's written from the point of view of a woman called Bernice Callanan in 2016, and then she has a later story to herself in 2020. And I kind of like Bernice. She hasn't had it easy. So I'll just read the first part of this story set in 2016. It's called The Callanans Went to Paris. Bernice stood in her mother's bedroom holding a large bottle of body lotion aloft in her right hand. Her mother, Mrs. Vivian Callan, sat on the bed, both arms folded, and her general demeanour that of a sulky teenager caught smoking. She was wearing her best coat and a matching scarf. A carry-on suitcase sat next to Mrs. Callanan, its contents spilling out onto the duvet. I told you already, you can only bring liquids of 100 millilitres or less, Bernice said. Sure, they'll never notice if I wrap it up in my dressing gown. Mrs. Callanan, arms still folded, shrugged her shoulders and looked up at Bernice. They would. Bernice placed the bottle of body lotion firmly on her mother's dressing table. Look, we can buy you some in the duty-free, she said, turning her attention back to the suitcase. Or when we get there. I've paid for our flights, haven't I? I should be able to take what I want, Mrs. Callanan said, fingering her scarf. It's to prevent terrorists from blowing up the plane. Bernice opened her mouth to say something else, but thought better of it. Instead, she rolled up a jumper and placed it carefully back in the case. Downstairs, the front doorbell rang. Oh God, that must be the taxi, said Bernice. She raced out of the bedroom and shouted down the stairs. Colin, will you answer the door? If it's the taxi, tell him to wait a few minutes. Colin was Bernice's only sibling. The only job she'd asked of him was to keep an eye out for the taxi. She returned to her mother's bedroom and began to hurriedly repack the bag. This was the third time she had had to edit her mother's luggage. The first was 2 weeks ago, when her mother had shown her a large suitcase filled with enough items to see her through an Arctic voyage. The second was last week, when Bernice supplied her with a smart carry-on case. The third was today, shortly before they were due to leave for the airport. They were only going to Paris for the weekend. I think it's a disgrace. Mrs. Callanan sat unmoving. Doorbell rang again. Why doesn't he answer the bloody door? Said Bernice. I specifically asked him. I'll get there in a minute, her mother said. Right, said Bernice. She placed her mother's fluffy dressing gown on top of everything else, pushed down the lid and forced the zipper closed. As she shoved a plastic bag of travel-sized toiletries into her mother's handbag, the doorbell rang again 3 times, urgently. I'll come back in a minute and carry down your case, Bernice said over her shoulder to her mother before running down the stairs. Bernice almost tripped over her own small, slightly battered Samsonite in her rush to open the front door. A tired-looking woman stood on the doorstep. She wore a yellow fluorescent jacket over a black raincoat. A heavy-looking black bag hung over her shoulder, and she held a bulky notepad on a clipboard. Hello, she said. Sorry to bother you. I'm calling about the census. Bernice looked past her to check the taxi's whereabouts. The woman held up the badge that hung from a lanyard round her neck. I just need to give you a form and ask you a few questions. Bernice turned back to peer at the ID. It looked official, though the photo could have been of any middle-aged female. Honestly, I don't have time for this. Bernice looked pointedly at the watch on her wrist, a big old Timex that had belonged to her late father. No problem, the woman said. This is number 5 Liberty Terrace, isn't it? Yes, said Bernice. Great, I'll just give you the form. So, how many people live here? My mother and my brother, Bernice said. I'm only staying here temporarily. I'm hoping to be out of here before Census Day. Before I go out of my mind, she added, but only to herself. The census lady wrote something hurriedly on her clipboard. Look, Bernice said, we're just about to leave for the airport. Right, sorry. Well, here's the form you'll need to fill out. Bernice accepted the form and plunked it on the hall table inside the door, just as a taxi glided to a halt on the street outside the house. Mrs. Callanan slowly descended the stairs, calling out, "I'm nearly ready now. Who's this?" Bernice waved at the taxi driver and gave him a thumbs up before turning back to her mother, who was standing in the hall. "It's about the census. Would you ever find Colin? Tell him the taxi's here." "I will as soon as I find the case for my glasses." Mrs. Callanan ambled off into the sitting room. "Would you mind giving me a contact number?" the census lady asked. "Oh, for God's sake," Bernice muttered. She recited her mobile number to the census lady, who scribbled it on her pad and headed off down the path. "We'll be out in 2 minutes," Bernice told the taxi driver, before running inside to search for her brother. Colin was sitting in the back garden, leisurely smoking a cigarette. "The taxi's waiting," she said. All right, I'll be there in a minute. Is Ma ready?" "Yes," said Bernice. She had found her mother's glasses case on the kitchen counter. "I'll just finish my fag and I'll be in." "Right, remember to lock the back door before we leave." Once Colin and her mother and the luggage were all safely installed in the taxi, Bernice had second thoughts. "Wait a second," she said, and ran inside again to double check. Just as well she did. The back door had not been locked. Back in the taxi, she bit her lip and decided to say nothing.
That's absolutely fabulous. It's really, the characters are so wonderful, and you can feel Bernice's frustration from the very first paragraph. I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about how that story came about, what the genesis was, and that leads me on to a bigger question then, which is where your starting point was. Did you start with this location that turned out to be Liberty Terrace, or did you start with a couple of characters and then wonder what the neighbours were up to?
That's a good question, Anne. I suppose the first thing is that the Callanans went to Paris. That's a story that that came from a snippet that I did for a writing exercise when I was doing the MA in writing in UCC. And that year was very busy for me because my other collection came out. My son was doing the Leaving Cert and I was doing this MA. So as far as I recall, there was an exercise set by Mary Morrissey, and I think it must have been on setting. So I chose a setting of a French restaurant that I have been in several times. It's called Chartier. And I don't really, it was nothing more than a snippet as far as I was concerned. And I was talking to Mary Morrissey not long ago and she couldn't remember it at all. But I definitely had an dysfunctional Irish family in a French restaurant. And so when Dura Press asked me, "What are you doing, Madeleine? Have you got a second collection?" I said, "No, I haven't, but I've got some stories that some previously published, some snippets, and I'm just thinking they might work together." And I think that I might be able to do a collection with a link to the census. Because I also had another very, very short piece that I did for a charity anthology, and it's called Looking at the Stars. It was in aid of the Simon community, and it was edited by Kerry O'Brien and Alice Kinsella, and that's ages and ages ago. And I just did a really short piece about a homeless boy who sort of squats in a house, and I'd been chatting to a guy in the street and he was almost 18, and so I'd done this very short thing, but I thought it wasn't finished. So again, I had snippets that were never finished. And with Dura Press's encouragement and a bit of pressure, I started working on these other snippets and turning them into hopefully fully fledged short stories. So it was a combination of a time situation and a concept that I would take the temperature of contemporary Ireland. That sounds very fancy, but in a small urban area, just have these people living their lives and see where the connections would come in and how it would all work. And I was going to call the collection Census, which is the title of the tiny little story that appeared in this Looking at the Stars anthology. And then I was very smart altogether. I said to Dura Press, I can have that ready by the time of the next census in 2021. So my idea of taking the temperature of the nation, I ended up with me in the situation where everybody was taking their temperature all the time and everything had changed. And so the story there at the Callanans couldn't have happened in 2019 or 2020 because nobody was traveling in planes anymore, etc. So everything got thrown into sort of disarray. And then it ended up being some kind of organic process by which I did manage to finish the stories and they all kind of fit together, but not without a lot of help from my very good writing friends, including Anne and many more who I hope I've thanked in the acknowledgements, and also the encouragement, of course, of Danielle, looking on as I panicked.
You know, the lockdown, it does seem to have added a lot to the, you know, just reading the stories in the order in the book, and that development, because it goes from 2016 to 2020, doesn't it? And actually the lockdown seems to have been a gift for the stories, really, because it has made people act in very interesting ways, you know, sort of people have behaved in a different way from normal times, let's say. So ultimately, did you feel that it helped you to finish the collection, or was it just an absolute pain in the neck to try and make sense of it?
I was extremely worried about it all. I mean, Liberty Terrace is actually eventually was the title suggested by Dura Press. But the other danger about this kind of carry-on in writing is that there are all these little characters who come in as cameos.
Yeah.
And you start wanting to write a story for each of them as well, but you know you don't have time because you're already late. This was delivered to Dura Press 3 months late. And again, like, thanks to my writing friends, loads of people who read the stories and also, just as importantly, told me, don't worry, Madeleine, I know this has happened and this has happened and you've been delayed here and delayed there, but you will get it done. The encouragement is huge. But I actually had 2 terraces originally. I had so many characters that I wanted to do. I actually had Liberty Terrace and Providence Place. And one of the things that really drove me crazy in the end was that I had to do a map to try and show myself where each person lived, to try to make sure that, say, if one person is down the street there and the other person is going home, you know, who would see whom at which point in time. And I wasted loads of time just swapping, putting them into different houses along the street. And eventually I had to, of course, narrow it down. So it's Liberty Terrace, and there's a little map just to show people where, because I got so obsessed as to where they were. And now there is no Providence Place, but you know, I might build another terrace there at some future stage.
It's a really excellent map, and I definitely referred to it several times myself while I was reading through the collection, because the stories aren't told in numerical order. You don't start at house number 1 and then move along the terrace, do you? It's kind of back and forth. And I'm wondering how much of that was your decision and how much was input from Dura Press, or was it all your decision which order to put the stories in and which house you kind of bounced back and forth to?
You know, it is surprising. Dura Press, John Walsh was very instrumental in my first collection when I knew even less than I do now about what I'm doing. But he was the one who put everything into order and dumped 4 or 5 stories. And I realized that his order was just right, given the stories that I had. But this time, I actually put them in order myself. And he threw out one. He might have dumped another one earlier on in the process when I had just had 7 stories and a vague concept, and those stories got rewritten quite a lot. But this time, maybe now because I just know more about short story collections or whatever, or maybe it seemed like a natural order because I was so worried about, not about setting, but about time. Time was a huge issue. So I think I sort of put it together myself, and I put together the what I would call the happier stories at the beginning and the end, because I just thought, I was thinking that we'd all been through so much in the past while due to COVID-19 that I didn't want to inflict too much darkness on people.
Yeah.
And so I thought that this was ironically a happier collection than my first one.
It actually feels very satisfying because it's bookended by those stories with William Dearborn and a young lad whose name has escaped me because I've got such a terrible name.
Martin.
Martin. It's so lovely because they, you do end up back at their house, and it's just a lovely story to end the collection, and just their relationship and how it's progressed, I think is really lovely. And you really, I mean, the stories are, for me, a perfect blend of humor and darkness. And Kevin Barry on the cover says that they're fizzing dark comedies. And I'm just wondering which you feel more drawn to, the light or the shade, because you're very good at both, I have to say.
I think if I hadn't originally, when I was 45 back in 2005, I attended what was really my first workshop in the short story form with Claire Keegan, who was then writer in residence at UCC. And she was in her 2nd year there. So, and she actually left that December. So I just had 2 months of once a week free writing workshops with Claire Keegan. And I think if it were not for that, I would probably have written very light, sort of comedic, or just lighter fiction, I think, if indeed I would have written at all. But she insisted, I think, that I put some darkness into my work. She was really good to me. The first story I wrote for her workshop was my first real short story ever. And it had 3 different characters talking, and it was an awful mess, but it made her laugh. She thought it was really funny. And she said, like, this is awful, Madeleine, but it's very funny. But you must not fall in love with your characters. You must choose one character for this story. Just take it from one point of view and just get, you can't just have all fun, like, this is not life. And she said, so what character are you going to tell the story from? And I said, I think I'll try it from each character's point of view. Oh, good. Because it meant I was prepared to work at it, to find out which character story it really was. But I think, I don't know, I think I would have been drawn to just writing very light-hearted fiction, were it not for being educated really in trying to dig a little bit deeper, because life is neither black nor white, dark nor light. And I think having both elements in is the most honest way to write if you're writing realistic fiction.
I'm just going to very quickly throw in a question that's related to something you were discussing there earlier about the map of Liberty Terrace. And I'm wondering, Madeleine, you have this fabulous map down on paper that goes with the book. Did you find yourself, you know, during the time that you're putting the collection together, going around with this visual map in your head of Liberty Terrace? So was it like there was this place in your head that was superimposing itself on reality, for want of a better word, as you were going around the city?
That's a really good question, Danielle. You know, the way during the first lockdown, you know, I'm in the city centre in Cork. The streets were so quiet and we were going for a lot of walks. When I walked on my own, I was always on the lookout for Liberty Terrace, you know, a place that was like Liberty Terrace. I did have it sort of in my mind. And then I also had a huge problem because I had a couple of people living in houses that could not be those smaller terraced houses. And that's when the idea of my own map came to mind, so that Milo's mother, who features in 2 stories, she doesn't actually live on Liberty Terrace. So in the map, there's just a little signpost and it just says Milo's mother, 2 km. You know, she's living 2 kilometers away.
Madeleine, I was going to ask you a more general question this time, which is that over the last few years, you've had lots of writers at Fiction at the Friary. I'm just wondering, what's the best piece of writing advice you've ever been given?
I did a workshop once with the late Alistair MacLeod, a Canadian writer who only wrote 2 short story collections and 1 novel, because he was also, he worked as a miner and a logger, and then he went to college and he became a professor of English and creative writing in the University of Windsor, Ontario, I think. And he was just wonderful. He was a slow writer. And one thing I think about that is that, you know, he may not have produced much work, but what he produced was very, very beautiful and very good, and very much his own. But what he said always was, the best fiction is specific in its setting, but universal in its theme. And I think there's a lot in that, you know, specific and universal.
I think you've definitely captured that in the collection. You know, it does feel, obviously the location makes it very specific, and also, you know, I think you've portrayed Cork really well. You know, it feels very much like Cork. And also just these extraordinary times that we've gone through the last year, like everybody can relate to. You know, things like Jake out in his shirt and tie, so he's Zoom ready at to the waist, and then jogger bottoms where he can't be seen, and you know, things like the table not being cleared from breakfast, because what's the point, because everybody's living there all the time anyway, nobody's going out, and you know, they're just all these things that we can kind of relate to. So very much universal and at the same time very personal. So yeah, I think you've applied that advice very well to your own work.
Thanks a million for those kind words. It's always, as we all know, so scary putting something out into the world. And, you know, there are years when everything goes wrong. There are years when everything goes right. There are years when your life flourishes and your writing work flourishes, and there are years when they are not. But at the end of the day, what I think Danielle would agree with this, that what we all need is support and a really good community of writers in Cork, because that is good for everyone. And so I want to thank everyone who has supported Fiction at the Friary and everything we do, because we're really lucky here in Cork, particularly, I think, with the support that we get. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think Fiction at the Friary has been a big part of that. You know, I think a lot of people have benefited from having that on our doorstep, and I certainly have. So thank you too for that.
But Madeleine, you very kindly contributed a story a couple of years back to an anthology I edited, Counterparts, that was published by Stinging Fly Press in aid of Peter McVerry Trust. It was an anthology with a legal theme. And I'm wondering if you find that your legal background overlaps with your writing craft in any way.
It does in one way, Danielle, and that is that I write fiction, not fact or memoir, because I don't want anyone to sue me for libel or anything like that. So I think I will be sticking to fiction for a while anyway. Unlike yourself, I'm not sure that that my legal career was in fact a help in writing, but that may be because I was working in London mainly after I qualified in criminal law, and then I became a legal editor because at the time I was qualified in Ireland but not in England, so my pay was very low. And by the time I had qualified again as an English solicitor, I was working in legal editing, and I became a senior editor and a project manager. So in that kind of intensive editing where you're also fact checking and updating the law, etc., it's not actually, you're dotting a lot of I's and crossing a lot of T's, and that I think is in complete contradiction to creative writing, where you have to let go of for your first draft anyway, you have to let go of that kind of self-awareness that you're supposed to have your sentence all proper and your spelling proper and like a little footnote to everything to prove that what you're saying in A above is correct, and to cite the statute that comes from or whatever. So I'm not entirely sure that law helped me. On the other hand, I loved doing criminal legal aid when I was much younger woman and I had more energy, and I loved the characters. And in the first job I had, it was great really, because unlike many firms, I was given enough time to talk to each client, and before ever talking about the specifics of the case, and some of them were big cases, some of them were little cases, and in an awful lot of those cases, the person I was talking to would be guilty of something. Maybe not the actual charge they were charged with, but there was something going on. But my boss loved giving me all these clients, whether or not I would keep running the case or he would take it over or run it jointly with me if it was a murder or a big drugs case. The first thing that he would do is plonk someone in front of me and say, "Now, Madeleine, this is Miss D'Arcy," he would say. And he'd ask me to take a history, a personal history of that client. And I loved it because everybody came in with their own story, and they, of course, they were stressed, but they started telling things about their lives that were really useful, because at the end of the day, a lot of the time, when someone pleads guilty, what you're trying to do is show the judge the real person and what happened to make them act in the way they did. So I've just contradicted myself Thank you, Danielle. Law was useful.
Yes, I was just about to say there that that does actually sound quite a lot like writing fiction.
I have one last question to ask, which is, what is next for you? What are you working on currently, or what are you hoping to work on next?
I have finished a novel. I had 2 weeks recently where I went back and looked at it all over again. Once it's launched, once the sort of Liberty Tourist thing is over, I'm going to give it one last bit of a go over and send it out and hope that maybe somebody will pick it up. But if not, that's okay. I have a draft idea for another novel, which will be in one voice only, because by now I could definitely run a workshop on how not to write a novel, because the novel that I have has got 4 different points of view, and that's really hard to put together. So then I'm hoping to do another novel and some more short stories, but most of all, I'm hoping that we will all be able to get together soon and talk and have fun. And I'm also hoping to meet all of my workshop friends again in real life, not on Zoom.
Madeleine, do you want to do the second reading?
Well, I'll just read a little bit from a story called Trolley, because previously I read the beginning of The Callanans Went to Paris, and this is another story featuring Bernice Callanan, also from her point of view. But now she's living alone in the house in Liberty Terrace during the pandemic. So I'm just going to read just a few paragraphs, sort of from the middle. So she's 39 and divorced. Before the pandemic, she never imagined for one moment that she'd miss the days spent working 9 to 5 in the City Hall. The Home Improvements Grants Department consisted of Bernice, Sheila, and Siobhan, and they shared the open plan office on the 3rd floor with the accounts section, a larger team with about a dozen staff. Every day, the same old ding-dong in Bernice's section. Sheila and Siobhan chittering and cackling and complaining about their families, gossiping about everyone else behind their backs, making constant trips to the small kitchen shared by everyone on floor 3, bemoaning the irony of working in home improvements, but never doing any home renovations themselves, and generally wasting as much time as possible. Bernice did not like to think that she shared any traits with Sheila and Siobhan, but sometimes she had to admit that maybe she was stuck in even more of a rut than they were. When the new guy arrived in accounts, Sheila and Siobhan mocked him mercilessly behind his back. A chunky young man with brown velvety eyes like a cow's, he hummed to himself in the elevator and on the stairs, and he hummed as he strolled past the home improvement grants section on his way to the staff room, bang on 1 p.m. every day with a Tupperware container in his hand. When Sheila first heard the humming, she raised her eyebrows and whispered, "What kind of weirdo is that young lad?" Siobhan ambled out to the kitchen and reported back. "A real mammy's boy, heating up his dinner," she said. "Smells delicious though. Mammy sure can cook." The shared staff room on floor 3 was small, with barely enough room for a water cooler, a kettle, a sink, and the said microwave, plus a table and 6 chairs. One lunchtime, soon after Ambrose arrived at City Hall, Bernice was eating a perfectly decent cheese and salad sandwich when he hummed in and placed his container in the microwave. The aroma of his reheated meal was heavenly, and when he took it out, she couldn't resist asking what it was. "Just some leftover cock oven with a bit of rice," he said, looking down at his plate. "Smells delicious," said Bernice. "Thanks," he said. He smiled shyly at her then. "Would you like some?" "Oh, no, thanks, I'm fine." He sat his bulk carefully down on the chair opposite her and began to eat. "I might have put in too many shallots." "You made it yourself?" "Yeah, I love cooking." He ate with delicacy, she noted, as she took a bite of her now distinctly unappealing sandwich. "I can hardly boil an egg myself." "My mother taught me. She was a brilliant cook." Bernice thought about her own mother. Mrs. Callanan had not been a domestic goddess, though she had made sure the family was well dressed and never overfed. A memory came, unwelcome. Her mother snarling across the kitchen table at her father. "Eat with your mouth shut." Her brother raising his eyes to heaven, herself saying nothing, listening to the scraping sounds of knives and forks on the blue and white willow pattern plates. All dead now. She missed her humble father most and had been heartbroken by his demise. The deaths of her mother and her errant brother had been different. Even now, a sick mix of guilt and horror made her stomach turn whenever she recalled how they had died. "My mother was hopeless," said Bernice. Cooking made her cross.
Huge thanks to Madeleine for being on the other side of the questions today. And we're so grateful to have Anne with us today to lead the fascinating discussion. So thank you, Anne.
Thanks so much for having me, Danielle.
Liberty Terrace is published this week by Dura Press, and it's really warm, funny, and profound book. So make sure that you get yourselves a copy. It's a triumph. Our book raffle is happening online today. So if you go to our Twitter page at Fiction Friary or Facebook at Fiction at the Friary, or indeed to our shiny new Instagram account, which we're very grateful to Stephen O'Shea for setting up for us. You'll find details on how to take part in the free book raffle. We look forward to seeing you all again at next month's Fiction at the Friary, but for the moment, it's goodbye from us.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Thank you so much, Anne. It's actually been a pleasure to be on the other side of the equation here, and see you soon.